We Get Outdoors Nation. Sometimes you bump into a guy who you could just talk forever with. And I bumped into this guy, Mike, the other day. He happens to work for one of the most awesome wool brands on planet Earth, in my opinion, American made. Go check out Duckworth as a shameless plug. And I'm sure we'll get into more stuff about Duckworth as we talk. But Mike, hey, welcome to the long form We Get Outdoors podcast.
I really appreciate that. I'm honored to be aboard, and like you were just saying, we were just chatting before you hit the record button. We could have been doing that for hours before we actually got to business and why we're meeting up. So I'm excited to give your audience a little taste of what we were just chatting about.
That's it. You had to hold me to task and go, hey, Rob, hit record, get on with it. So just before we jump into it, what should the world know about Mike?
I live in Bozeman, Montana right now. I grew up mostly in Connecticut on the East Coast of the United States. Before I lived in Bozeman, I was living in New York City, and I basically just had a complete life change where I said, this place is making me crazy. I don't think that this is the type of place that will be where I want to live the rest of my life. And I pulled the plug and moved out to the mountains here, and I haven't looked back. And you would think that would be kind of limiting in who I see and what I talk to, but I've had, just this past weekend, a bunch of buddies out here and friends visiting, and it's been a blast, and it's been a special thing to share. So I'm kind of, we were just talking about it on the 6 and 16 segment that I'm kind of the archetype of what people are doing right now. I moved before COVID, but people are looking for that higher quality of life, and I'm happy that that's kind of the way that I chose to be recently. So if that gives you any idea of who I am to begin with, I jumped ship and would do it again if Bozeman starts to suck. So a lot of people are moving here, so it's getting a little packed, but that's how it's going. And that's me.
That's awesome. It's interesting as a starting point. I've lived and worked in the countryside my entire life. And until I moved to South Africa. And I now live, as we were talking before we hit record, in a flipping ginormous city that may even be bigger than New York in terms of population size. And I feel less healthy the longer I live in a city for, mentally and physically. And I've kind of had this realization that maybe other people feel as crap as I feel when I live in a city and just accept it as normal. And yet when I live in the countryside, I feel vibrant and alive. And do you think as human beings, we're designed to live in a 24/7 place like in New York, cramped up in apartments, never really getting to settle and calm down?
I have a lot of friends that grew up in New York City and similarly large American cities. But I think New York is kind of the obviously prime example of an American city. It's obviously the best known. It's probably one of the most famous cities in the world, if not the most famous. Maybe that's just a very American-centric point of view. However, I've got my buddies that grew up there, and they think there's no other way to live. They look at folks like myself who grew up 50 minutes outside of New York, and we're in the country, right? I don't live in the country. When I drive around Montana, that's pretty country sometimes. They think it's the best thing ever. I, having lived in both, and maybe we're just creatures of habit or wherever we grew up, but I definitely loved, I loved being on the subway. I loved seeing all the different people. The food was awesome. Obviously, there's just so much to do. You could probably go see a new thing in New York City for the rest of your life and never quite actually see everything. But I do think that there's that element of struggle financially. It's a very expensive place to be. There's a pace. People walk really fast, and I don't know about in Johannesburg, but people are always moving really quickly. And you, by nature, end up doing that subconsciously. You're always moving fast. You're always getting from point A to point B. And I think in a place like New York, my experience was rarely I rarely stopped and thought on my journey how much I was appreciating getting from, my apartment to this restaurant, or, getting from my apartment to work or wherever I was heading. Whereas I think, now that I live out here and it's slower, I walk slower when I'm walking around Bozeman, or if I'm driving around, I go visit people in other parts of the state, or I go to other places in the region, and it just gives you a lot more time to think. Um, I'm definitely a lot calmer as a person. I mean, it's, there's an energy, there's an electricity to a place like New York City. But, I don't, to answer your question, I don't know if people are meant to live in that massive of a community. I think
Mm.
there's a lot of good things that come out of a community like that. You can't deny the arts. You can't deny a pressure makes diamonds. Pressure also bursts pipes. But um, it's it's not an experience for me. I could see why people like it, but I do think unless you have oodles and oodles of money, um, New York can be a pretty challenging place to live. And yeah, people do accept it for various reasons. But I do think, I grew up with woods right behind my house, and I went home to visit my parents one weekend at their place, and walked the dog out in the woods behind the house, and listened to the birds chirp and the wind through the trees. This was the middle of December, and there's snow on the ground, and I decided right then and there that I was moving. So
Mm.
I was like, I haven't felt this good in a long time.
It's funny, isn't it? You talk about energy, and I promise not to go down some ethereal rabbit hole about frequencies in the world or anything else. But there is, to a very large city, there is a very interesting energy that is exciting yet terrifying at the same time. It's like uh, almost you've just about got control of that energy, but you kind of are on a tipping point of not having it. And I just find that you can miss, I don't know, it's like living life on the edge of a razor, and life's fine whilst you're balanced. But as with New York, a financial upset, like you get made redundant or you lose your job, suddenly that razor cuts you. Whereas in slower, more rural communities, the heads up that you're going to lose your job is usually months away as opposed to hours or days away. And so often in the more countryside states and provinces, I just find you get a bigger heads up. You can almost look into the future more and go, oh crap, that could happen. Maybe I should take this action. Whereas I find in the city, by the time you go, oh crap, it's already happened.
I think you're exactly right. And by the way, that was poetically said. Um, Living on a razor's edge, and if you become redundant, for example, you might get sliced. But I think that I encountered people in New York where that experience, that sort of living on the razor's edge, is probably similar to the way, in a different sense, but in the same ballpark as people who, for example, go skydiving. There's if or free soloing, what have you, these extreme sports where there's definitely an element of lack of control, and a massive element of danger. I think there's an addictive quality to that. I had a boss in New York City who, she would sleep at our office, because she just loved working and grinding it out that much. And I was like, that's pretty sad. And this is, the person who I'm supposed to be looking up to, a boss, what I'm aspiring to in my role. And I was like, this is definitely the exact opposite of what I want to be doing when I have, two kids at home and a spouse waiting for me. And I just think that there is, though, that addictive quality of trying to harness that and trying to be a part of all that, and rather not be sliced but be on top of it. But the sad thing is I think a lot of people in a place like New York, or a city that large, unless they have a position of legitimate power, are pretty at the whim of people that do, because you are so replaceable in so many ways. I found moving to Montana that even though I'm young, I'm 26 years old, working for Duckworth as their marketing director. They looked at my experience. They saw what I had done, which was actually, I was pretty lucky in New York to have some pretty cool media production experience working for some bigger brands. But they're like, well, age isn't anything if you can't perform, right? And so I found that I've actually had a much larger, for example, professional voice, even at my age, than I would in a place like New York City, because New York City, there's kind of a little bit like, you're kind of like a pledge, you're like, you're going through the motions and paying your respects so that one day you can maybe taste some of the better parts of having made it in a place like that. So there's definitely all those elements involved in a bigger city. And for me, I was just like, you know what, it's all kind of made up, right? So I'm just going to go move to Bozeman, Montana, where they might have their own made up things, but it's maybe a little bit more aligned with what I'm looking for from life.
How was that for you when you obviously went there and made the decision, and that's what I'm going to do, but then ultimately you throw all your possessions into the back of a van or a truck or something like that and arrive in Bozeman? Like, that's the archetypal culture shock of one to the other. What was that first few weeks like when you got there?
Well, actually, I didn't have a car in New York. Obviously, taking the subway and doing some of those rent-a-bike deals. So I flew with basically everything I owned, and so I was wearing, like 4 shirts and like 2 jackets. I was wearing my snow boots on the airplane, 2 hats. It was really actually ridiculous moving through the airport. And actually, the day that I left was actually when the American TSA, I think it's Transportation Security Administration, they were on strike. So the line to leave literally maybe took 3 hours just to get to the security at the airport. So I was carrying all this heavy stuff. I was sweating and in pain. My shoulders hurt. But when I moved here, I was actually in the middle of a polar vortex. So it was in the mornings when I'd wake up to scrape my car to go to work. It was like minus 40,
Oh,
getting into that ballpark. And I don't know what that is in Celsius, so I apologize, but it's
minus 40 is minus 40 in both. It's where Fahrenheit and Celsius join together.
okay. So there you go. It was really, really cold, and I didn't know anyone really. I had some friends of friends, but it wasn't like I could just kind of get out and go hiking and kind of enjoy the nature either. So it was a little bit depressing, if I'm being honest. But I figured, I obviously I'd make friends in time, and the weather would clear up. And, at that, for example, everyone skis in the winter. So that's kind of one of the great parts about being in Montana. At that temp, you're not really getting out to do that either. So culture shock is definitely an understatement. It was a massive lifestyle adjustment. And then things started clicking. I started making buddies, and I just said yes to every social event that I could get my hands on. And now it's, I've got people I climb with and people I ski with and friends to go out to bars with, and just a really solid group of people to be around. Actually, a lot of them too have moved from markets like New York City, maybe smaller cities where they've moved from Baltimore, or they've moved from Seattle or Chicago, but and a couple friends that were definitely born and raised here. But it's got just a little bit more of a laid back factor that I needed. And I'm glad to see that my hunch of it being that way is definitely answered as a reality.
Mm. It's interesting when you move somewhere slower, if you can keep hold of your 60% of your work ethic or 70% of your productivity ethic from a New York, and you move somewhere slower, you actually can stand out as almost a genius. Probably neither of us are geniuses, but
I'm definitely not.
no, me neither. But the pace is when you take one speed and put it into a slower pace environment, you kind of achieve more than a lot of other people do in that environment, even though it feels slower for you. And certainly for me, moving from the UK to South Africa, the pace of business in South Africa is probably 30 or 40% of the pace of business in London. And so I just took my London attitude and moved here, reduced it a bit so I could chill out some more. And it's very strange that people are like, how do you get all that done in that short a time period? And I'm like, well, I thought I was being lazy.
Yeah, there's definitely some of that. And I do have a bunch of coworkers who again, I've worked 2 jobs here in Montana. And I've had coworkers that came from larger markets, and some of them brought a lot of what you were just describing with them. And I think that I did too. And it definitely helps. It helps develop yourself as a standout, or however you want to put it. It definitely sets you a cut above. I did actually have people I worked with who lived in those bigger markets who just said, never again. And they came and adopted a very slow style, but they had just enough of that, big city cunning to make sure that, they're staying out of it while looking involved. So it's kind of funny, actually. I've had a couple coworkers like that did nothing, but it kind of looks like they do. The biggest thing that I brought from New York that, a piece of mentality was actually things are obviously a lot cheaper here. And I, in New York, found myself often working on a pretty extreme budget, eating a hot dog or dollar slice or whatever. And I shouldn't complain because I know that's a lot more than even a lot of people have anywhere in the world. But coming to Montana, I'll still, a pint of beer in New York can easily cost $10 with tax and tip. Here in Montana, it can be as cheap as $3. With tax and tip included. There's no sales tax, so it's really just $2 plus a tip if you want to give a 50% tip, which
which is pretty generous.
On $2 is not really that big of a deal, but it's a pretty crazy thing to walk around Montana still kind of having a little of that sticker shock PTSD, thinking that everything's really expensive when it's not at all. So. But it's a lot of, as more people are moving here during the pandemic, I mean, the housing market here has definitely gotten a lot more expensive. So I wouldn't be surprised to see things like beer prices, for example, getting more expensive as rents perhaps get more expensive, commercial rents. I do know that there is on sort of that subject, I know that there's sort of I think it's called a Big Mac index, and you can actually kind of. Yeah. So I like to think of a pint of beer index. So as long as I can get a pint for $2 to $4, I'll be pretty happy.
I often, for a number of years, measured my success in life in how many pints of beer I earned by the hour.
There you go.
That's it. So if like this year I can afford 4 pints by the hour, but next year I can afford 5 pints by the hour, I'm winning at life.
Well, you don't want to definitely take your earnings and go directly convert it into those pints, or you might lose that job.
I don't know. I think when I was your age, I may well have tried that on several weeks.
Well, I can tell you there's weekends here and there where that's definitely the case.
So when you feel like somebody's put Vaseline on your credit card because it's been swiped that quickly and that frequently, you're like, oh, who did that?
Yeah, well, I've had a couple friends in town recently, and it's just a duty sort of call scenario recently. So I'm glad to have them all out of here. One of them missed their flights yesterday, which tells you a little bit about the whole weekend. Got him out of here, and I'm glad to say that spending will probably decrease.
So I'm on a lot of different homesteading Facebook groups, and I'm into that whole backcountry, go and get a cabin in the middle of nowhere living. My wife asked mistakenly a couple of years ago, while we're living here in South Africa, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be? And I was like, well, it's going to be the back of nowhere in Idaho, Montana, or Alaska. Those were my three, like a cabin, and either you have to hike for 2 days to get there, ride a quad bike for a day, or get a plane to get there. That would be my idea of heaven. Um, is that the big draw to Montana for people? They just want to go and find some space and some air to breathe, or what is sucking people closer and closer towards those more, I don't know, Wild West states is how I view them. I know there's not West, by the way, but
no, yeah, I think there's a tremendous amount of romanticism built into these places. I mean, for the longest time, you'd hear about Montana, places like Wyoming or Idaho, Montana, Alaska in old Western novels or movies, and it almost kind of had a Timbuktu quality to it, as far as living in the United States is anyway. And suddenly those places are incredibly attractive because I think the pandemic really forced everyone to think a bit more critically about what they do during their daily life. I think it's, for better or worse, has definitely made us as a society sort of face mortality in ways that we haven't before. And a lot of people are like, shoot, right before this, I was basically working 12 to 14 hours a day in a job that I hated in a city that, outside of maybe friends, wasn't really speaking to me, or it was leading me to an unhealthy lifestyle. And a place like Montana has provided this sort of sense of space, a sort of sense of reset. I think, the American West has always been this place where you can kind of just start from absolute scratch, even though that's not the reality anymore. Obviously, Montana is much modernized compared to when homesteaders spreading west originally started to end up there. I think there's also a phenomenon that the American experience is that people moved westward for basically 250 years, and they all kind of smashed into places like Washington and California. And those are some of the most populated places in the United States. Coastal California is really dense and it's really expensive right now. And I think it's almost, you can think of it in sort of a wave. The wave smashed into the furthest most barrier and sort of is slowly drifting back across the entire continent. And it's not just Bozeman, Montana, actually. Tertiary, secondary cities, very small cities like Bozeman are suddenly seeing massive booms in residency and people wanting to live a much more quiet, simple life. And, cities like Phoenix, Arizona, which is actually pretty large to begin with, but definitely has a different vibe than, say, a San Diego or a Los Angeles. Orlando, Florida is apparently blowing up. Columbus, Ohio, all these cities that you typically wouldn't have heard of, or really would have been all that desirable even a year ago. So it's pretty amazing what the pandemic has done in terms of shaking things up here in the United States. I'm not too aware if the same thing's happening abroad, but that's how it's playing out. And I think Montana just has that wide open feel. And after maybe being quarantined for a couple months, people maybe needed space most of all to sort of feel better. I don't know.
It's bizarre. There's lots of things that weirdly are coming together at the same time. So up until relatively recently, for me to leave the city I live in right now would have been possible and yet a lot more challenging. But the pandemic has been weird because my wife, for instance, who's a psychologist, she works for a very large university, and she's been told she's not going back to the office. Like, this isn't just for COVID. This is, you're not going back to the office ever. You're working at home online. A lot of my work can be done online, and then you go and piece that together with stuff like Elon Musk's Starlink that I've just signed up for, where you can get ridiculously fast internet, 150 megabytes a second upload and download with almost no latency. And you can do that pretty much on a mountainside in the middle of nowhere in a third world country. Um, well, if we don't need to go to the office and everything can be done on the internet, and you can get the internet in Timbuktu, which was the example you gave a second ago, why do we all need to go and punish ourselves so much? And the city loses all of its appeal if you're stuck in a small apartment that you can, like in 2 steps, touch wall to wall. It's not a very nice place to be. So it feels like we've had, I'd say, a perfect storm, but not necessarily in a negative way.
Yeah, I had that almost exact apartment experience in New York. I lived my roommates and I, right out of college, we got a room or an apartment where all 4 of our bedrooms were actually underground, under street level. I was actually one of the lucky ones to have a window that looked out onto a back sort of sunken alleyway that was basically turned into like a glorified courtyard. And so, I had maybe 20 minutes of actual sunlight come through the window, and there was like a dead pigeon down there, and some, standing water with like a cigarette butt or 2 in it. And I was like, this isn't, what am I doing here? I'm paying an arm and a leg. I couldn't imagine what it'd been like to be during COVID, to be stuck in there and really told you can't get out. And in places with that population density, the way that obviously the virus moved through there, those governments and those mayors and whatnot had really no other choice than to protect its people with a really extreme measure. But I still think that that's exactly it. It's what's the point in being in a place like New York City if you can't, go to a restaurant without potentially being turned around because it's at 25% capacity, or I think in Los Angeles, for example, you couldn't go to the beach. It's like the some of the massive pieces of what make these cities what they are were gone. And actually, you talk to people from New York City, and they get really defensive about New York not being dead. And I believe them. I'm not suggesting that it is, but you can't say that New York is as good when you shut down Broadway and shut down restaurants and shut down, certain walking spaces. It can't possibly be what made it a draw for 12 million people before a pandemic, close it all down. So whether it's temporary or not, people are moving to places like Bozeman. I have a hunch that a lot of people, though, are going to miss those things that they loved about a place like New York. And as soon as, the barriers are lifted, they're going to get back. But I think a lot of people will also be just charmed by a different way of life that they hadn't imagined, and decide to try it out for real.
That's incredible. Like myself, you've chosen to move a fair distance away from where you were brought up, and I guess I've done the same, moving from the UK to Southern Africa. What was it about your and that's, by the way, that's relatively unique, isn't it? Because a lot of people will be born in a city, will grow up in a city, will work in a city, will retire in a city, and die in the same city. That's a very common phenomenon. What was it about your upbringing that equipped you to go and say, even before the pandemic, screw it, I'm out. I'm going to go somewhere else and move all that distance?
Well, I should actually mention that my mom actually grew up in Montana for a period of time.
Ah,
Um, she lived here. She was born in Denver. Denver was a much different place than it is now. I mean, if it wasn't like Bozeman is now, but it's, in terms of being so small, but it certainly wasn't a really much of a city. She lived in Bozeman, Montana. My grandparents still have a place out here. So I'd grown up coming out to Montana. I never had imagined I would have ever chosen to live here. I mean, the amount of change that Montana has undergone, and even my lifetime, is pretty remarkable. But I think before that, a seed was planted to be able to make a decision to move to a place that's so outdoor centric and such in such harmony with wildlife in many ways. And that being that, as a kid, I was pretty much every weekend taken to a museum or a zoo. I'm not a zoo guy so much anymore, just because as an adult, I kind of see it as maybe a different sort of darker place. But as a child, um, I was just in love with the idea of being around animals and learning about nature and science. And growing up in Connecticut with those woods right behind my house, my best friend and I would just literally every single day, all summer long, go build forts in the woods, go, catch frogs and salamanders. Um, and we spent probably hundreds of hours in those woods and over the years. So it was easy for me to basically look back and see what made you tick, what made me really excited at that age, and how can I possibly incorporate that into a modern lifestyle where I'm still providing for myself and still living comfortably. There's people out here that they're so on the extremes end of what I was just describing, that they live they live really, really simply, and that's awesome. I mean, I really wish I could give up some of my creature comforts, but at the end of the day, I do like watching a little Netflix and having a couple nice micro brews or whatever. So I figured that coming to a place like Bozeman, there was a lot of employment opportunity, but I also could you know go out and be in the mountains literally in 20 minutes on a pretty good hike,
Mm.
and moose or elk and possibly bear, depending on how far I go and what direction. But that's pretty special. So I really hope it maintains some of that uniqueness. It's not like any place I've ever lived or know of really outside of it.
Well, it's funny because there's a mass transit of people in the US at the moment, from what I can pick up. There's a lot of people from California who've busily gone and headed themselves off to places like Austin, Texas. And then I heard on the Joe Rogan podcast the other day, he's like, we're in danger of Austin becoming a mini LA. It's going to become California. And there's parts of me that feels when you move somewhere like that, you almost want to stop everybody else from going there. Like, we'll let 10% new people in, but the rest can all stay away, just because we want it to keep its charm without it becoming mini New York, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I grapple with. Having had family here, having even had my great grandfather, have a spot out here when I was a kid, and I knew him for a while. He was around till I was about 10. I feel this family connection. However, if you talk to people who live here, and Montanans are extremely proud of saying, "I'm fourth generation" or "I'm fifth generation." Um, that's a real thing. That you hear a lot from people that actually were born and raised here. What do I really have to say about people moving here? I moved here 2 years ago, and that's not when it was just this massive influx, because it wasn't during a pandemic. I just happened to pick a spot that would suddenly be very popular amongst certain demographics. California is definitely one of those states that a lot of people have decided to go to a place like Montana. Um, I would say to people that you should pick a place to live that speaks to you as is. Um, I don't think you should ever move to a place with the intention of trying to shape it to you.
Mm.
Unless, of course, it's a horrible place because there's, I don't know, bad people running around and doing things that are um, abjectly to the disadvantage of, human rights or whatever. I mean, maybe you go to a place and you're like, there's some bad stuff going on. I should probably change it. But, moving to a place like Bozeman, I would say, don't look at it as a canvas. Just, look at it as a finished product and try to integrate yourself as best as you possibly can. And, a place like Boston's the same way. Don't, if there was something you didn't like about where you came from, or if there's something that people there wouldn't like, what's the sense in trying to bring that element to that new spot?
It's interesting because human beings are really clever at taking their shit with them. So
packing shit.
Yeah, that's it. Well, whatever you hate about one place, you move to the next place and just take, and slowly it becomes the place that you hate because you didn't leave the shit behind. And it's easier said than done, but it's also a great opportunity to. Did you experience this? You've got to almost reinvent who Mike is. You get to leave some of the bits about you that you don't particularly like in New York. And when people say, "Hey, who are you?" you can go, "My name's Mike." And maybe it's just with a different smile on your face, but you get a new opportunity to reinvent and start again with a clean, I wouldn't say a clean slate, but with a different starting point.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely something that can be really appealing. I mean, like I said, living in New York, there was an element of stress and anxiety, and the way that I approach problems with a little bit of a frantic mindset, like it's got to be done right now. And I think that was impacting me. Um, so I don't know if I necessarily left behind any unsavory bits. I think I'm, kind of susceptible to the environment that I'm in. I think most of us are. So I was able to shed pieces of me that were a byproduct of living in such a pressure cooker and living in such a fast-paced environment where it's very obvious walking down the street in a place like New York that cash is king. You either have it or you don't, and your life in a spot like that is completely dictated by how much you have of it, unless you want to be bohemian and be an artist or make music. And I have none of those talents, so if I was to just try that, it would just be bad. But a place like Bozeman, I think that I was able to, well, I do appreciate, it wasn't much of a change, but I was able to be in a place where it's not really about all that. It's really about how much you enjoy the minutes that are afforded to all of us. So but here's a pretty superficial example. I can like grow out my hair and a beard without really thinking about it, and no one ever calls me out on it. That's kind of nice because I don't really care to spend the time shaving my face every morning. It's just something that I don't put as much value into as maybe some people looking sharp. And I can wear a t-shirt and sweats to the office, and that's also not a big deal as long as the work's getting done and it's being done well. So that's a really superficial way to look at it. Just a superficial example, but I think a place that's a bit quieter like this does allow you to leave behind some maybe not necessarily important things that you used to find maybe important or used to put some emphasis on.
So let's step into a little bit of Duckworth, but not 100% of Duckworth. There's a growing trend that I think Donald Trump brought to the foreground, or certainly highlighted around import. And his thing was all about a trade balance. Import less from China, more American made, so on and so forth. But there is a growing trend throughout the world in South Africa, we say local is lekker. Lekker is sort of great, amazing. There's a growing trend for that. However, it comes at a mental change as well, because cheap Chinese shit is just cheap Chinese shit. Like you can pick it up for almost no dollars. But the world is pushing against it. But equally, you look at Duckworth, incredible heirloom, lifelong garments, but equally, they're probably 3 times the price of what you could buy if it came from China. And there's no knock on that. That's just like a reality. How do you reckon we start squaring the circle of going back to buying a wool shirt that will last you for 15 years as opposed to 15 weeks, but being prepared to spend the real money to go and get something that will last you that long?
I think specifically, I think the Duckworth way of thinking about being American made is not necessarily we're going to stick it to these other manufacturers elsewhere, and there's an element of pride. We're bringing a piece of American heritage back stateside. Wool clothing production and wool production have been part and parcel to a lot of states' history, including Montana's. New England, though, almost 2,000 miles away, if not more, in the United States, had a massive and very thriving textile production industry that is now almost dead. So bringing that technical knowledge back home, bringing that piece of our heritage back home is definitely important to the Duckworth ethos. We really wouldn't have it any other way. There's another way to think about it too, which is that when you have a product being made, for example, some of our merino wool competitors, they will, get their wool from New Zealand and Australia and Uruguay, and then they'll get that spun into yarn in Turkey and Azerbaijan and Croatia, and then that yarn will then travel to, Taiwan to be made into a fabric, and then it's cut and sewn into a garment in China and Japan, and then you see where I'm getting it. It creates such a massive, unnecessary footprint environmentally. I mean, that's tens of thousands worth of miles of emissions per garment that can be really truncated when you have a vertically integrated supply chain like ours, where we do everything in the United States, every single step of the process. And then here's the real kicker for the consumer, and you should have some pride in this, if not anything else. When you're talking about merino wool, if you look at some of our competitors that have that very diverse foreign supply chain or offshore supply chain, they're charging just about the same price. So they're ripping you off. It's kind of like when you hear Ray-Ban makes their sunglasses for $1, but you buy them for 150. We're not passing on to you anything other than what it costs to be, make quality here in this country. And, again, if you really looked at some of our competitors, I don't want to name drop, but if you looked at some of Duckworth's competitors and even the most well-known ones, you'll see that their supply chain is what I was just describing earlier. And they're charging a similar, if not more expensive price point. And they're, again, you're a sucker. You're being ripped off. So there's honestly that whole thing that you should definitely factor into your purchasing is am I paying for what it actually costs to make, or am I paying a margin that's sort of been invented by a marketer somewhere or what have you? And no disrespect to my fellow marketers, but that's, for many businesses, that's part of the job, is creating sort of a load of BS to pass on to the consumer. And I feel really lucky in my job as marketing director for Duckworth that I don't have to BS. The story is authentic. I could drive 2 hours away from my home right now and tell you exactly where the wool in your shirt came from. And then I can point out, even though I won't, because that's just proprietary information, but where our facilities are, where, our things get made here in the country. And you could drive to them, no passport needed. So it's a pretty cool process, to say the least.
It strikes me that, and this is something that's been playing in my mind for the past couple of years, is just how much of a hypocrite I've been. But that's probably me holding myself to a higher standard than maybe I need to. but how much of hypocrites quite a lot of us have become. We say, I'm proudly British, you're proudly American, right? And so you'd think, well, if you're proudly American, you'd want to ensure that you're keeping employment levels up in the United States, that you're not exporting dollars to foreign countries, that you're actually ensuring that the world at home is good first. And it's certainly slapped me. I got to go in 2019 to an abattoir where animals are killed, but like factory raised animals. And suddenly I'm like, holy crap, I love steak. I eat meat. I'm quite a big advocate of eating meat, to be honest. And now I've suddenly seen how these animals are raised and how they're killed. I'm a friggin' hypocrite. I'm eating stuff that I wouldn't be prepared to do myself. So last year I went hunting for the first time. And I wonder what would happen if we all truly stopped and thought about our footprint and where we choose to direct our dollars to, whether we'd actually live life differently.
Yeah, I think about that a lot actually. Today I was at the grocery market and I eat meat too. And I eat a lot less of it than I used to, but I eat meat, and I think that steak and bacon and a well done chicken or piece of fish is pinnacle cuisine. I'm sort of an Anthony Bourdain devotee, and he's a
Ah,
huge yeah, I love the guy. Huge proponent of eating meat, and that food can be sometimes cruel. But however, I was at the grocery market tonight, and I really grappled with what I was buying. Because at this specific market chain I was at, it's pretty safe to assume that every piece of meat in there was, factory raised and slaughtered. Um, so tonight I just bought vegetable based proteins, and tomorrow I'm going to go to a nice butcher here in Bozeman where I know the animals were raised in a much more ethical way and then slaughtered probably in the field wherever they literally were standing at the time where it was time to harvest the meat. Um, but then again, too, I mean, I want to get out and do a lot more hunting and gather my meat that way. I feel that is a much more noble way to consume a creature. At the very least, you should definitely understand that the food was a living thing that was killed to be consumed. And if you're going to take that on, it's who's better to do it than yourself, I suppose. But I mean, we're all hypocrites. I've got a light bulb on here that is burning, electricity or using electricity that was made from presumably burning fossil fuels, and I personally believe that those can contribute to some nasty things. However, I think we all gotta try to take a step back and think and vote with our dollars and feet, really. We were talking about that a bit earlier with my move. I mean, that's a vote with my feet.
mm,
But there's nothing that you can sort of speak more loudly than with how you're purchasing, because like you said, if everyone just decided to look at everything a little bit more holistically, perhaps there would be some pretty substantial market changes. And this goes back to clothing too, right? I mean, I have synthetics. I have clothing. I have a lot of clothing that's made from synthetic materials. Um, and you learn that, these microplastics are found in some of the most remote snow fields of the Rockies. And at the bottom of, some of the deepest trenches of the ocean. And you're kind of like, dang, is this plastic clothing also like getting into my skin? I mean, what's going on here? Apparently we eat about a credit card's worth of plastic a week.
mm,
That
terrifying.
gave me, yeah, that's pretty crazy. So definitely got to start thinking a little bit more about what's going on around us and how we're contributing to that.
I think in general terms, we've got to a place where people have maybe not forgotten how to learn, but where they get their information from is is so easily manipulated that it's become unreal. So anti-hunting people would say it's horrific, the animal dies a terrible death, blah, 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 so on and so forth. People are just out there drunk, shooting everything that walks, so on and so forth. It's very interesting from my perspective, having been to an abattoir and seen that experience, which is horrible, through to going hunting and seeing a large kudu, which is an African deer, being shot at 300 meters while it was stood there eating grass. And, by the time you heard the bang of the rifle, the animal was dead of a headshot lying on the ground. It didn't know, feel, or sense anything. And yes, my friend pulled the trigger. Yes, we watched it. But to be honest, I can with a clean conscience eat that meat. The meat that comes from the abattoir, if I'm to be very honest, I have a very, very, very sick conscience at eating that meat, but just because of how it's processed and what it experiences, it's just horrible. And I wonder whether people have lost the ability to learn through experience because experience is painful, whereas YouTube on a sofa is quite comfy. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element to society today where people do not want to confront what makes them uncomfortable. I think you can find that example in so many different pieces of even American politics. But I kind of thought of hunting as barbaric before I moved out here, and then I really put myself into thinking about what it is, and especially in the context of bow hunting, the playing field has really been quite leveled. The animal, if with a clean shot doesn't suffer at all, it dies in a natural environment. It lived its life as it should, and in many instances, it's a prey animal. And perhaps if you hadn't perhaps in this exact ecosystem here in Montana, perhaps a wolf would have gotten it or a bear.
Mm.
Its life is kind of unfortunately spent on the run a little bit, probably much like a kudu's, but there's definitely an element to hunting where it seems you've integrated yourself into the circle of life, and you can respect your place in it in a different way than if you're eating, mass-produced rotisserie chicken. But there is this element of detachment. People don't really put two and two together. And it doesn't necessarily need to be meat either, right? Some of the loudest voices at an anti-hunting protest might be wearing sneakers where the rubber and construction were all, sourced and put together by children, in horrible conditions. So we're to go back to your original point, we're kind of all hypocrites living in a glass house. And I think to look at each other actually with empathy and try to understand people's choices, and then get into that face-to-face personal education point that you were just starting to harp on would be pretty massively instrumental. Unfortunately, people are definitely a little bit more inclined to fight and put a line in the sand and stand on either side of it. So it's a difficult a lot of these questions are we're having to confront really quickly. Whether or what our footprint is, or what our all that this more sustainability sort of conversation we've been talking about. But you're right. I think you can live like an ostrich only so long until you really should be forced to kind of step out and see exactly how you are contributing and how you are part of the larger world. So and what that means for many different people and players involved.
Yeah, I think we have a habit of giving away our individual giving away our individual power, maybe responsibility, but our individual power. It's very easy to go and put, I don't know, $100 to Greenpeace every month, for instance, as like an online donation. Well, if you were just to choose to buy your clothing from Duckworth, you could argue the toss that you're actually having a bigger impact than Greenpeace, because you've directly, through supply and demand, influenced less air miles, less containers, less, as you were saying, wool from Australia that goes to Azerbaijan, followed by Taiwan, followed by somewhere else, followed by the US for sale for the end product. Well, maybe we actually do have more power if we stop to think about it and direct our dollars in better directions.
Yeah, I think that's really it. And I also want to say, I pre-pandemic love traveling. It's something that I think is super important. It's allowed me to understand the world in ways that I wasn't able to even fathom before. I used to say, like, I could never leave the US because there's still so much here I still haven't seen. And you could spend a lifetime going around this country trying to find every different subculture and every different piece of natural beauty, because it is a large country with a lot of different facets happening all at once, different phenomenons happening all at the same time. And I love going to places like China and India. I lived in India for about 3 months working there, and I lived in the UK, as I mentioned to you earlier. And I have good friends in all of those places. So find people in all of those places just trying to, make an honest day's work. However, I think when you do have the ability to make a choice that's a bit more direct, like you said, buying from a company like Duckworth or buying from a company that's thinking a bit more critically about how it's going about its operations, that is a bit more effective in so many ways than putting money into a company or into a nonprofit, where it almost kind of acts as sort of I've absolved my sins. I'm kind of, this is me cleaning my conscience here, and then I'm going to go back to doing, whatever, and not really thinking about what it all means. And if it's actually in the opposite direction of my act of giving money to that sort of foundation. So, again, voting with your dollar is something really potent and powerful that everyone can do. And I've certainly, as I've gotten older and developed what my values are and what matters to me, it's something that I've put a lot more stock into, and that includes buying from companies like Duckworth that are putting this top of mind.
Yeah, I just realized I'm sat here drinking out of a plastic water bottle, and I'm like, yes, there we go. How ironic is that? How ironic! It's
well, I mean, you can't be hard on yourself, though, right? Because these are all habits and things that have been normalized for a long time. So drinking out of a plastic water bottle, I mean, listen, I avoid doing that, but I also drive 10 hours down to Utah to see friends and get 2 tanks of gas. So it's like, I mean, it's all splitting hairs, and it's definitely just something to whittle down, as long as you're living, try to improve, and hopefully we can collectively start making some dents.
I think so. It's a very, very peculiar old time, where I think for a lot of people, what we thought we knew from like the 50s through to the start of the change of the century, that 50-year window, what we thought we knew to be true from there, we're suddenly finding out there is some truth, but it's not as true as we thought it was. And that then shakes everybody's brains quite dramatically, because humans don't like change habitually. They strive towards comfort and known norms. And I just guess we're going to end up needing to go and value It was interesting. So in Joburg, this is as I ramble on, we ended up here in South Africa, in Johannesburg, in COVID. At one point in time, because of the lockdowns, I think we had 48 hours worth of petrol and diesel left up here. And after that, we were done. And then you suddenly start thinking, well, how does the food get to the supermarket if there's no petrol and diesel? And and then if there's no food in the supermarket, well, that's only 48 hours away. Then what? Who knows how to grow vegetables? Who even thinks that they could even start doing any of that stuff? And I was having a conversation with my mum, who was talking about her upbringing just after the Second World War in the UK, where you didn't have grass in your back garden. It was all vegetable patches, and there was chickens and rabbits for meat at the back of the garden. And maybe we've lost some of that stuff, and maybe we're closer to needing to know how to do some of those things that our grandparents did than we would honestly want to admit to be truthful for us.
I think that's absolutely the case. I actually remember hearing about that Johannesburg situation with the amount of energy that was like left over. And it was definitely sort of presented anyway in some media I saw here as sort of a canary in a coal mine situation. I didn't actually really keep up on that because I was a little preoccupied with the pandemic and everything else going on. So I kind of forgot all about that until just now. I think that there's definitely going to need to be some of that that knowledge, that know-how that is it's incredible. Like, it's crazy because that, what happened in the United States here when the supply chain got all messed up at the beginning of the pandemic, people were like, I don't know if this happened in other places, but people were like fist fighting over toilet paper. For me, the stupidest part about that wasn't the fact that people were fist fighting over toilet paper. And I'm sure, I don't know if you saw the videos or not, it's that's the last thing you need if shit hits the fan. Is you don't need toilet paper, you need food, you need water. That is like the fact that people were willing to be combative over something that is a literal modern treat. I mean, the fact that we use a piece of soft toilet paper to clean up after we go to the restroom that's like a life, that's a human experience first, last 100 years max. But you need, I was surprised I didn't see people, fist fighting over cans of beans or water if you're going to fist fight over something like that. So I just think that to me showed how far removed people are from understanding what actually counts. That it was kind of hilariously depressing in a way, because yeah, I mean, if it really hit the fan, people would definitely not know how to take care of themselves and know how to prioritize certain things. And it's actually tragically, in Texas recently, a lot of people have lost their lives because they simply didn't know how to cope with the situation that hit Texas a week and a half ago with all the cold. And people lost their lives making decisions like sitting in their car in the garage to stay warm, where that they didn't understand the science there. And so if we ever really did have an issue, I think a lot of people would definitely struggle to find the resources and wherewithal to persevere. I mean, it would be, I like the beginning of COVID, when I saw some of those videos, I was like, this is total chaos. And I felt really grateful to be a place like Montana, because I was like, I don't have a vegetable patch. I wouldn't know really where to start, but I could certainly go out and catch some fish and, shoot a deer if it really came down to it, and figure out how to, cook it up. But if you live in a place like New York, I don't know what you do. I don't know what you do if there's no food coming in onto the island.
Mm, it's weird. Despite what different people's maybe politics or beliefs are, it's very interesting that we haven't evolved much more than survival of the fittest in many regards, and almost a lot of people by accident probably have become pretty mentally unfit and physically unfit. You know, the oranges arrive in Walmart, but it must be Harry Potter who gets them there, because nobody really seems to know these days about where they come from or how they arrive.
Yeah.
And that makes us a pretty unfit population of planet Earth in a lot of respects. And I think a lot of people think, well, what's the other opportunity? I become a doomsday prepper and go and buy a ex-nuclear warhead silo somewhere and go and convert it into a bunker. And in truth, most of the answers are probably found somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. It's a funny phenomenon, those doomsday prepper sort of situations, because there's like a whole TV show about them here. I don't know if the same thing happens in South Africa. I assume that there's probably a couple people that are probably doing that sort of thing. I think about myself. Sometimes it'll be, it's the middle of winter in Montana, and I'm pissed that there's not bok choy or kiwis in stock. Because I like both of those a lot, and I can't find it that readily. But it is something that it's just a miracle of the time that we live in that I can get either one of those. I mean, Montana in the winter 100 years ago was probably pretty miserable. There wasn't a ski resort you could go to and kill your time.
Mm-hmm.
You were chopping wood or trying to find food or, staying warm. You probably weren't bathing for the whole winter. Times were probably really tough. It definitely, I don't know. It definitely, when we see the supply chain get so thrown into whack like we did recently, it definitely puts into question, are we sort of standing on a house of cards? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but if there's any indication of when, we've had a couple wrinkles, and there's been examples where people have suffered. So you're right. We have allowed ourselves to sort of atrophy, in a sense, into a place of entitlement and expectancy that these things just happen. And when we pay taxes, for example, we do expect to have clean running water and access to food and access to services that are very modern by any human standard, 1900 and before is concerned. So, I do expect these things because that's kind of what you get when you subscribe to the place that you live. And if it doesn't have what you need, you can try to move if you have the resources to do so. However, I mean, it's just we're definitely pretty vulnerable if everything goes pretty out of whack. So, kiwis and bok choy would be the least of my problems if trucks really did stop coming here with food.
Kiwis and bok choy. Yeah, they don't naturally fit in -40 in Montana, do they?
No, they don't. Not that I'm aware of, anyway.
Cool. Well, Mike, I think we're gonna wind this up now. It's time for me to go be a dad, and I bet it's time for you to go and get some sleep, because it's probably quite late. We're about 9 hours apart. I just wanted to thank you for this conversation and exploring some more about individual responsibility and ideas, I suppose, that maybe people should be considering in their world. I want to thank Duckworth for giving you the time to be here as well, and the cool hat. I like the hat.
Yeah, nice logo.
Look at that. So thanks to Duckworth as well. And folks, go check out Duckworth's website. Is there anything in closing from yourself, Mike, that you want to share with the world?
I just I want to keep harping on the idea that we should all be definitely thinking about what we're bringing into the spaces that we appreciate. And your audience is an outdoor minded space, outdoor minded audience, I should say. And what does that mean to you, and what does that mean to you in the terms of the longevity of that passion? So just continue to think critically and stop and appreciate it, but also ask yourself the important questions. And I think if we all did that, we would definitely ensure that everything would go pretty smooth sailing. So that's my parting words. I appreciate everyone listening to me ramble about all these different ideas, and hopefully there was some connectivity to it all.
Yeah, I think so. There's an interesting verse in the Bible that talks about legacy, and that a legacy is only a legacy if your children's children truly benefit from it. And I think to wrap all this up, maybe we should be thinking further into the future about what legacy we're leaving for our children's children, and then what we can do to positively impact that today. Thanks for your time, Mike, and stay awesome. I look forward to the next time we get to chat and hopefully have a beer in person one day.
Please, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on.
It's a pleasure.